Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you again for joining us. This is Joy Warland. I'm the consultant for continuing education in small and rural libraries at the Department of Libraries. Today's workshop is the second of a pair of workshops on disaster planning for Vermont libraries. The first one was a week ago, and I think many of you were here for that, and that was with Sally Blanchard O'Brien, and she shared a wealth of practical steps to keep your libraries safe by creating preemptive policies and documents so you know what to do when a crisis hits, if it does. And both of these workshops are presented in collaboration with the Vermont Historical Records Program and the Vermont Arts and Culture Disaster and Resilience Network. So today, for the intermediate workshop, we're pleased to welcome Rachel Onuf, and Rachel's the Vermont Historical Records Program Director at the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. And she's going to offer a deeper dive into risk assessment, hazard mitigation, and developing a preparedness mindset. So we're also fortunate to have a librarian here to talk about her experience with this work, Lucinda Walker from the Norwich Public Library. Thank you so much, both of you, for being with us. So again, if you can keep your mics and cameras off, you can use the raise hand button at the end. There's a little place you can raise your hand if you want to ask a question or say something when we have Q&A at the end, and then you can write in the chat at any time. Rachel won't be able to see it, but I will keep an eye on it and let her know if there's something to address immediately. And I think that's about all I have to say. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. Thank you again for being here, and take it away, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Joy, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. And thanks to Sally, my colleague, who set the table so beautifully last week. And it sounds like some of you are coming back for more. For some of you, this might be the first of the two. You did not attend the beginners. I have some overlap with what Sally talked about, but mostly new material. I have shamelessly taken some of her slides just to kind of bring home certain points. So thank you, Sally, for your wonderful work on getting material ready for these workshops. And wholehearted thanks to Lucinda for joining us today as well. And I have told her to butt in if she's got things to say. I'll try to also offer opportunities for her to speak up. Lucinda took part in a series of disaster preparedness workshops that we did in Norwich way back in the late winter of 2019. And just to give you a taste, you're doing an hour today. Maybe you did a total of 2 hours if you did last week as well. That group did 4 full mornings, and it extended into the afternoon on a couple of those occasions. So this is a topic that you can spend a good deal of time learning more about. What I would encourage you all to do, knowing how busy you are, is to more try to integrate some of this idea of being aware of and being preparing for and thinking about emergencies and how you might be better prepared for them into your day-to-day work. And I tend to think of myself as a worst case scenario girl, and there's definite disadvantages to that, but it can also be useful in terms of thinking about what could possibly happen and trying to be prepared for it should it actually come to pass. So for those of you who were on last week's workshop, you'll find this slide familiar, but I really just want to bring home this point that the two organizations that Sally and I are active in are the Vermont Historical Records Program and the Vermont Arts and Culture Disaster and Resilience Network. And both of these organizations are here as free resources to help you. We can help with everything from specifically helping with the disaster plan development or running a training session. And through the VHRP, we have a broader mandate and mission, so we can do on-site assessments related to collections care, help you with grant conceptualization and development, all sorts of things that might be useful depending on what kind of holdings you have in your library. So don't forget about us. We're here for you, and we want to be part of your network. And I'll talk about the importance of networks as we get into the presentation today. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a review of emergency management and disaster plans and how important it is to cultivate a preparedness mindset. As I was saying, as you go about your day-to-day, try to integrate this into the way you approach your job, if not your life. what some hazard identification and risk assessment activities might be. And this is what we'll really focus on today. And it can be really good preparatory work for a disaster planning process. It also does not have to be tied to that, and it can be something that you take up in and of itself. And it's going to kind of spur you to additional action. It's a really great place to start if you haven't done anything for preparing for emergencies. And want to then talk a bit about different efforts you might take to mitigate some of those hazards that you've identified, and also hope to have time for questions and discussion. You know, if some of you from last week are halfway through developing your disaster plan and you've got some questions about some of the sections and what kind of information you should be putting in there. So some of these emergency management terms that you may want to be familiar with, and some of these again were up with Sally's presentation, and some are new. Why do you need to know these? It's basically so that if there is an emergency scenario happening, you are able to speak the language of your emergency management and your first responders. This is the kind of words they use. And we all of our disciplines have different acronyms, and librarians certainly have quite a few that we like to use. But in this state, we talk about the SEOC, which is the State Emergency Operations Center. And again, usually that's a physical space, but during the pandemic, that actually went virtual for the first time ever, and it remains virtual. The incident command system is kind of that foundational framework or structure that is used in managing a response to an emergency or a disaster, which is what they mean by incident. The idea of this framework is that it can be scoped and scaled to for any sort of event. So it could be a really minor disaster that's highly localized, might be enough to stand up an incident command system and in order to respond to it effectively. Or it might be a much larger disaster that's bringing in all different types of responders, and different municipalities are responding, and there needs to be a real clear line of command and control, and that's what this establishes. And among the different types of emergency responders, they had different words and different language that they used. So it really helped kind of streamline how those first responders were able to work together and collaboratively in response. Interestingly, sometimes an ICS will be, or an IC, an Incident Command Center, will be put up in advance of an event, and it may not even be an event that is going to definitely turn into a disaster, like that something is forecasted to happen. Things like the Super Bowl might get an ICS where people are in position and prepared to respond in the event of a situation. And this is all within NIMS, or the National Incident Management System. And that's what kind of sets the larger paradigm within which this happens, and it's a set of high-level operations and protocols that determine how actions happen. You also might hear the term partner annexes thrown around, and that refers to the different types of responders who might be involved in an incident response. There also could be support annexes, which might be things like VOADs, volunteer organizations active in disasters is what that stands for, or other non-governmental private sector groups that might be mobilized, like the Red Cross, to respond when things are happening. And the damage assessment is kind of the what goes on after the response, and you're about to enter the recovery phase, and how can you determine what it is that needs to happen. And again, just to look at the organization, you've got the IC, or the incident commander, and then these different command staff below. With smaller incidents, these different sections might be collapsed into only a few personnel, But again, it's meant to be scalable so that as needed, there will be people and sometimes multiple teams working through. And of course, when you've got a disaster happening, it's not on a 9 to 5 schedule. So one of the real reasons for having this kind of setup is that different people, actual people are coming in and filling these roles. And they need to know how they fit into the larger structure and who they're reporting to, and how that's where the line of command is and how they fit within it. If you're really excited by Incident Command System, there are free courses offered by FEMA's Emergency Management Institute, and I've taken a couple of them online. They're useful to help you kind of become more familiar with the terminology and get a better understanding of where local emergency management might be coming from. And then if you're really interested in it, I just wanted to point out that there is a book that's been developed by David Carmichael about implementing the ICS at the institutional level that's meant specifically for libraries, archives, museums, and other institutions. So that's available as well. And if you're really interested, I happen to have many copies of this, so please get in touch. I'd be happy to get one to you. I also want to note that David Carmichael recently gave a webinar about this topic that is on the resource list that Joy will put up in conjunction with the recording for this presentation. So you can listen to him speak about it as well. And so this idea of having a preparedness mindset, you want to think about all of this as a continuum. These different phases, you'll see they don't really seem to start. You could argue they start with mitigation. Some would say they start with preparation. And then if something happens, you need to respond and recover. But I would argue that even if there's no emergency or disaster happening, the continuum needs to be the mitigate and prepare continuum. That's something you should always be trying to incorporate into what you're doing and what you're thinking about, so that you're getting ready for, in some way, what might happen, or you've identified something and you're trying to fix it. And sometimes that can take a while, especially if you need to find funding or other resources in order to make that implementation happen. And just, think of emergency management as being very, very structured and standardized. But sometimes there's a different model as well that gets thrown out about the different phases of emergency management. Some folks put in prevention as a separate space, coming kind of between mitigation and preparedness. So prevention might be where you actually are developing your plans, and then your preparedness activity might be that you're training on how to actually use your plan. So the components of the disaster plan, and this is something Sally went into in great detail, so I'm not going to go much further than this, but just to remember that these are the high-level components you typically would have within your disaster plan. And the heart of it really is within the response procedures, and that's where you will really, as you develop the plan, that's probably where you're going to end up spending most of your time gathering information and making decisions about it. And you might have a separate, depending on the size of your library, you might have a separate emergency action plan that's more specifically focused on people, but you could incorporate that into your disaster plan, which does allow for space for evacuation plans and other things that are more related to people. And of course, the first thing to consider is human safety before you even begin to think about your building and before you begin to think about your collections. So people first, and that's something that you want to be mindful of course, as you're developing your plans and writing them out. So Lucinda, I've been talking a lot already, so I'd love to call on you to you were part of that workshop, and the intent was to develop a disaster plan over the course of the couple months that we were meeting every few weeks. So I would just love to hear a bit from you about whether you had a plan in advance, or is that your first plan, and what's been the life of your plan since you developed it back then?
Yeah. Well, I think like many people, I had attended many different, in that time it was like workshops, day-long workshops, and I always had a folder that said disaster plan, and inside would be whatever handouts I had gotten at that previous workshop. But it was really only at the workshop you did at the Norwich Historical Society, because it was more than one day. We had homework. You were saying that, that we had these half-day meetings, but we also had the homework that we needed to bring to the next class, if you will. And it was very helpful to have a partner. And my partner was Sarah Rooker at the Historical Society. We were kind of egging each other on. So really up until then, I would say I had just lofty plans, but until I started doing the work, I would say that it had just always been lofty plans. And the work was really, we talked a little about this yesterday. I would leave these meetings and just start seeing risk everywhere I looked. I mean, at the library to me looked like it was a flaming pile of risk. And at that time, I would say that my biggest concern was water, because we had just come through 2 massive mold remediation issues due to water seeping up from the ground, water coming in through the walls, none from any kind of environmental disaster of like broken pipes or anything, but more literally just water coming in from the outside. And what's interesting is that I never would have thought pandemic was not on my wavelength for disaster. And as we were getting ready to close last year, which our closing was like 3 weeks of starting in February until the stay-at-home order. One of the first things I did was I pulled out the disaster plan to kind of just look at. I knew there's nothing in there about pandemics, but I knew there was things in there about finances. How are you going to pay people? How are bills going to get done? Where, who's communicating? Communication was huge, and to look at what I had put down as who was going to be responsible for what was just very, very helpful. And also this idea of having things in the cloud. So I was one of the first things I uploaded to the new Google Drive that we set up, so that we could, as a staff, be able to work together still. So it was very helpful. It was only a year old at that time. Now, I looked at it a lot in March and April of 2020, and then I just pulled it out again recently, and I was like, oh, there's some updating that needs to be done. And I've learned some things. So I would definitely say it's not the kind of thing, it's the thing you always think, oh, I should do. You should do it. You should just really do this.
Thanks, Lucinda. And did you do it mostly on your own, or did you build a team, or were you kind of running around and asking the people who you knew would have the answers?
We're a small staff, so
Yeah.
I did a lot of it on my own, or I would talk to like my assistant director, Lisa. I will say I did a lot with taking photographs of things, because I realized that if you had asked me where the water turnoff thing was, you could describe it, but I'm visual in some ways, and I figured if we were in a disaster, we would want to see things. So there's a lot of photos in it. But we didn't have a team. And I think maybe that would be the next thing as I update this, is to really invest other people in it as well. And my board was a part of it too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And we did use, as a basis for the plan, we did use the Vermont disaster plan template, and trying to make this as simple a plan as possible that's still going to be useful. And the feedback I got from Sarah Rooker at Norwich Historical Society, I think she did much of the plan writing development also herself in consultation with others. But then she brought people in from her board, especially her collections committee, to review it together, and then to try to anticipate or build out scenarios of how they might use it. And she came back to me with the feedback that, Rachel, it's still a little too complicated. So knowing, you want to be able to hit that sweet spot, which is going to be different for different libraries, of what is going to be the appropriate information at the appropriate level that folks are going to be able to use this, especially initially, probably in response to kind of crisis scenario, potentially, when they're not necessarily thinking as clearly as possible. And absolutely, using photographs can be really helpful. Also, having a big honking sign that glows in the dark on your water shutoff thingy can be very, very helpful on the other end too. So yeah, just trying to imagine out situations, and that can be a really great time to kind of activate a team of people. Even if you think, actually, if this is going to get done, I'm not going to throw this at a committee or try to find a way for the 4 staff to actually be able to sit down together, or try to do this off hours, or, it may be that one of you is kind of the driver of developing it, gathering information from other people as needed, but then really try to make the commitment to come together to review it and then to practice it, to try it out. So that's something that I'll return to toward the end as well. And you don't have to use this disaster plan template. D-Plan is kind of like the TurboTax of disaster plans. I used it many years ago. It is very out of date and it is getting a revamp. I've been promised it'll be ready by the end of the year. And one thing they're doing is slimming it down. I used to teach a preservation management class for Simmons Library School and had my students do disaster plans using D-Plan for actual institutions. And if you printed the thing out, it was like 150 pages, which, again, in the event of an emergency, you don't necessarily want to be scrolling through. Sometimes some of that information was things about very detailed descriptions with pictures of how to actually salvage a wet book and a damp book and a slightly wettened book. So there's some information in there, again, that might have been useful, but too much kind of for the initial pass. And I think I talked to Sally about this, but I'd love for us at VHRP to develop a pocket prep, which is a pocket response plan specifically for Vermont libraries. This is really great because it crystallizes down what you need in the immediate response moment to a piece of paper that you can keep in your purse or in your pocket. You can get handy little Tyvek envelopes to keep them in. I have a few of those. And it can help with both your contact list on one side and then what you need to do in case you can't keep it in your head because you've never had to do it before. So it can be a really useful document, and I think it would be something that would be good to have for us to be able to offer as a template. And it doesn't take the place of a plan, but it's better than not having a plan. So again, what's going to work for you? What can you kind of identify as a short-term goal, and what do you want to work toward going into the future? So, as I threatened, I'm going to focus mostly on hazard identification and risk assessment, and kind of getting into the weeds on this work, which has 4 basic steps. You're going to identify what the hazards are that are most likely for your library, assess the risk of it happening, what's the probability or likelihood this will happen, implement as possible appropriate measures for those that you've identified as being your priorities. Continue to monitor the situation and reassess the risks because things change over time. Some things change seasonally. Some things change depending on what's happened in your environment. And there's different types of hazards. This is an image from, and maybe you've seen some, University of Cape Town's. This is their reading room. This happened on Sunday. It went up in flames. And one thing to be aware of here is I was looking for news reports today. Last I saw, librarians and archivists still had not been able to get into the building. They have not yet determined that it's safe to enter. So they still don't know days later the state of the collections. I mean, obviously, reading room's a total loss, but did the doors that closed, the fire doors, did they protect the collections on the other side? And of course, now the immediate concern here was the fire, but they used a whole lot of water to put the fire out. So now the concern is as much what is that water doing to the materials that it's potentially come into contact with. Another thing that this image evokes for me is to make the point that some hazards aren't just one or the other, right? So in this instance, this tragedy happened. It might have been a fire that somebody set, but unintentionally but a person, some human set a fire that then didn't get put all the way out. And then nature kicked in through the high winds that made that fire grow and come down toward the building. So sometimes hazards can work in concert to create a really disastrous situation. The Vermont SEMP, another acronym for you, or State Emergency Management Plan, takes a stab at identifying different types of hazards for our entire state. And now some of these are going to be more applicable to you depending on your location than others. And this is, they went through a HIRA, a hazard identification and risk assessment process, and they came up with these 24 different hazards that they think are of concern in Vermont. You'll see there are a number of natural hazards and lots of technological and human-caused hazards as well. And there's different ways to slice and dice the hazard types. So we think of the natural ones are ones I tend to obsess over and focus on, and that was covered. Sally showed you about this last week. The hazard assessment mitigation plan includes the different ones that have been identified. And this is considered a subpart of the overall state emergency management plan. And it's a combination of the probability of something happening and the potential impact if it is to happen. And that's a really powerful way of considering how to prioritize what you need to try to mitigate first. So this is an exercise that you can do for all sorts of whatever different hazards you identify that are specific to your library. Water-related things are up top, so fluvial erosion and inundation flooding. And fluvial erosion is when the water gets going so fast through a stream bed that it starts to shift the material and either makes that a deeper or a wider stream bed, and the erosion that it causes, as well as the water then pushing some of that material downstream and potentially dumping it someplace where you don't want it to be. And then ice and snow. Infectious disease outbreak, not a really high probability. And again, we might see that change with the next one. That plan is updated every 5 years. So water is a big deal in Vermont, probably in most parts. So here's the Thetford Barns in July 2017. And you might remember, I can't remember if it was the 2nd of July, but there was a torrential downpour that seemed to come out of nowhere and cause widespread flooding around the state. And it nailed the Thetford Barns, which had a rather innocuous stream right behind it. And that was, again, partly because of the Norwich Historical Society hosting those workshops. I got to know the folks at Thetford because they were participating in the workshop. And it kind of set up a network of communication. I would not necessarily have found out about those barns, except Marshall came to the workshop the next year and shared that story. And then we had a connection, and you'll see that those barns they figure in again pretty soon. There's also, again, industrial or environmental hazards that could be highly localized, within your building, or could be larger issues, and how the response happens, or where you're going to be able to get assistance might depend on how widespread a hazard is. And you can start to identify all of these different things and how likely they are for you, depending on where your library is placed. Technological hazards, the UVM, medical centers, hacking incident this year, I think, has probably elevated this. And in part, we pay attention because it costs so much money when something like this happens, and when networks are are compromised and information is stolen and systems can't work the way they're supposed to and can have just a domino effect out. There are, of course, things you can do to try to mitigate against these, and we'll talk about those as we get along. Obsolescence in this case means that you might have important files that are either in a format that is no longer able to be read by your machine, or you might have obsolete equipment that can't be used anymore. So software and hardware obsolescence is something to be aware of for any kind of files that you might be maintaining digitally. And humans are really large hazards. As librarians, you're aware of how prevalent arson can be in libraries. When I was living and working in Massachusetts, there were a number of stories I heard about libraries who still had book drops that went directly into the building, and kids kind of not intending to cause harm, but maybe they threw some sparklers in, or otherwise something going in the book drop that then caused a larger problem. Vandalism, bomb threats or active shooter threats, theft of materials, and then accidents that, unintentional things as well as intentional things are often done. So a little less than 2 years later, those same Thetford barns, and again, because of our connection through those workshops, Sarah Rooker sent me this photograph of the Thetford barns, and knowing Marshall, I was able to reach out to him and start talking to him about insurance and making sure that he was kind of doing what he needed to do in the immediate response once it was ascertained that the driver was fine, she was unhurt. So in this identification of the hazards, you've got kind of the different types, and you want to be looking at the big picture. So you can look at that state list from the SEMP and decide which ones seem more likely than not for where you are. And you can also start to kind of hone in on your building and to some extent on your collections and what you have and what you might be storing. The setting looks at things like your geography, whether you're in a city or town or in the country, being aware of who your neighbors are. Do you have manufacturing or industry, heavy industry close by? Do you have a railroad going by the back that carries freight on a regular basis? Do you know what that freight might be? Are they transporting hazardous materials? And what is your infrastructure like? Is your building really old? What's your water system like? What's your heat system like? Are you on a central sewer or water line? And what are the crime rates for your space in your area? Is that something that you need to take into consideration and think about in terms of what level of security you might want to have for your building? Inside, there might be hazards that are naturally occurring. You might want to identify whether you have fire protection in place or not, whether that's a smoke alarm or sprinklers. Has maintenance been done on a regular basis? Are you storing any chemicals in an insulated separate space? Do you have your bleach and your ammonia right next to each other? And again, they might be totally fine just sitting there in separate bottles, but if there was a fire, would that be a problem? Thinking out what might happen if other things started to happen. I am sure that there are buildings out there with asbestos or lead in the paint or PCBs. So these are things to be kind of aware of and to think about. And it can be really hard to see your space because you're in it. Well, maybe you haven't been in it, but this might be a good time when you start getting back into your libraries, if you've been out, to really look about you and see with fresh eyes and think about what might be potentially a hazard, either on its own or in conjunction with some other type of disaster happening. You also want to look at the outside of your building and what your landscaping is, whether it's making it easy for people to be close to the building without you noticing that they're there. Again, this matters in some parts of the state, less so in others. Is it well lit? Are the sidewalks smooth? Are there sidewalks? Has it been well maintained? Is your foundation solid? How's your roof? All of that stuff. And you might decide that there's some things that you're not necessarily qualified to determine. In that case, if you're lucky enough to have someone on your board who's a contractor or otherwise knows about buildings, that can be a really great resource. And if you're a municipal library, you can ask the town for who might be able to provide that service and help you do that assessment and identify what the potential hazards are. And if possible, start to develop a maintenance log. And that can be as simple as using one of the checklists I'll show you and just doing that every year or so and keeping that up to date, but keeping what you've had in the past as a baseline. So you see whether things have gotten worse, when maintenance was actually performed, and try to get out ahead of some issues. So some of the things that I've seen over time, if you've got a smoke alarm that annoyingly goes off when you don't want it to, not good. It might seem like a great idea if it's driving you crazy to cover it up, but don't cover it with plastic and duct tape, because you might think, oh, I'm just going to do this for a moment and then I'm going to deal with it, and then you don't deal with it. Another thing that it's very easy for this, I'm looking around my office, for things to just kind of accrue over time, especially in older buildings. We never have enough outlets, and as computers became more and more useful and popular and necessary, we started needing to put power strips into power strips into power strips. But these daisy chains can pose a real threat for fire. And you want to make sure, of course, that your fire extinguishers are inspected every year and that they're fully charged and that you can get to them easily. I've been to many sites where they have up-to-date inspected extinguishers, but they are they're buried behind boxes of supplies or the Christmas tree decorations that aren't being used right now. So you want to make sure that they're easy to get to. You also want to observe things that might not seem that obvious, like, well, the windows have some condensation, these double pane windows, but that could be an indication of a leak, and where that's happening, that could become a larger water incursion, that could lead to mold, that could lead to bugs. All sorts of things could spiral from these smaller issues. On the outside, you want to watch what any vegetation close to the building is doing, and make sure your gutters, if you have them, don't have grass growing out of them, but are able to do the job of channeling the water, not only off the roof, but then through the drain spouts, a number of feet away from the building, and hopefully the ground is sloped away from the building as well. In wintertime, you want to watch where snow might accumulate, or ice dams, or otherwise large icicles or other things that might be a hazard to people walking below if it's a path, or that might actually come down and somehow crash into windows. So again, thinking about it from all 4 seasons as well. So some things you might notice in the summer, but you may not be thinking about it until you also look at that building again in the wintertime. So a point being, you could try going out at different seasons as well, just to do a walk around the building. It needn't take a long time. It's just trying to, again, integrate this into your daily operations to the extent possible. And clapboards coming off, again, minor thing, but over time, this could become a much more serious issue. Within the collections, and this is more for libraries that might have larger local history collections, or have historically were more of a cultural center for their communities and might have lots of artifacts that might include guns. I've seen guns in public libraries, And there's also, I've seen chemicals or other old bottles of medical potions and elixirs that you're not entirely sure what's in them. Taxidermy was often preserved with arsenic. So if you've got some stuffed birds or animals, that could also potentially be a hazard. And chances are they're not, like, those things are not putting off any gases anymore. They've done all their last off-gassing. But they could, if people are touching them, and they could still get, if they're able to touch them, they still could get impacted by that getting on their skin. And again, if there is a fire, that could be something that is going to have a much stronger response to the flames. Knowing what the value of your collections is can be helpful too. And one of the things that often comes out in going over development of disaster plans is the importance of knowing what your insurance policy covers. And if you do have materials that have a higher value, talking to your insurance agent about whether it makes sense to have a special rider to cover the replacement value of those materials. There are templates. Again, you don't have to just try to make your own checklist to do this kind of risk assessment work. You could, and it's good to think, again, just think about this probability and impact as being the two things that you are assessing, and you might want to put your focus on things that are very likely to happen that will have an extreme impact. You can also make the case for the importance of, if you've got things that are likely to happen and it won't have a huge impact, but the third part of this triangle can be the cost it will take to do the mitigation. So if you have some low-lying fruit that you could easily fix, that would be something you might want to also do, in part to build momentum and to feel like you're actually making some progress. You know, if you determine you need to put in a sprinkler system, that's something that's going to cost a huge amount of money. So even if it's kind of the high for likely, that fire is a high likelihood for your building and it would have an extreme impact, that could be something you could work toward. But in the meantime, you might want to identify some work you can do that'll make you feel like you're making some progress and it doesn't cost as much money as something like that. So there are different checklists you can use. One I like is from Heritage Preservation. It's now hosted on the American Institute for Conservation website. They've got a host of different resources there. And again, I've got the link for this on the resource sheet. And this is just a 3-page risk prioritization worksheet where, again, if people like to be quantifying things, it makes you put in numbers. And it has a rubric for deciding on what the likelihood of occurrence would be on the number scale 1 to 5, and then the severity of the damage also on 1 to 5. So this can help you come up with, and it's available in a spreadsheet form as well. It can help you come up with what it is you might want to focus on or what your priorities should be. And once you've identified what they are, you want to try to implement the appropriate measures to fix them. Some risks you can just get rid of completely, but in most cases, you're just trying to mitigate them. You're trying to lessen the effect if they do actually happen. Other important hazard mitigation actions are to do some relationship building with your local first responders and emergency management, as well as sharing your preparedness mindset with your existing networks. So for implementing different measures, you want to start with those, again, that are most effective or that are related to your most likely risks. So in this case, if you've got some, if you've noticed that some of your ceiling tiles are stained, you could just simply replace the ceiling tiles. You could also try to find out if anyone has any institutional memory of how they got stained, and was that an event that was caused by pipes that are behind that tile, and if so, did the pipes get fixed? If If you don't have that kind of access to institutional records or memory, you could replace the tile and then just see if it gets stained again. I mean, that can be, again, what is the baseline? What are you noticing? And then what do you see changing? So is it this could be just a cosmetic fix, or it could be indicating that there's a larger problem behind it. And that's part of the value of keeping that emergency record within your disaster plan, is you've got in one place a record of those different, if you were at Norwich for Lucinda, the different mold remediation that have been done. So, 25 years from now, the library director can look and see, oh, this was an issue back then. There are funds available for hazard mitigation. The Vermont Arts Council, in part through their involvement with VACDaRN, they're the co-leads along with the VHRP, have really tried to emphasize that their cultural facilities grants can be used for hazard mitigation activities, whether it's installing sprinklers or putting in floodgates or doing something about the, about your setting, about your building, that's going to make the impact of a likely disaster less bad. They're open to funding that. Those grants are up to $30,000, and they do require a 1-to-1 match. And the next deadline, it's an annual opportunity. The next deadline is June 7th. And I'm happy to help with developing those proposals as well. Building relationships. So it's really valuable to make contact with emergency managers. They kind of intimidate me. I completely understand and how it can be scary to try to connect with them and build up on that relationship. But when I've actually talked to fire chiefs or police officers, they've been incredibly approachable and helpful. And in this case, again, at Norwich, we had Chief Leinhoff, who has since retired, come out and talk to us about fire and do a walkthrough. And he can show, folks with that background, they'll see things that you might not be able to see and make suggestions for how you can improve how you are being in your space. And in this case, we looked in the Knox box. And if you're not sure what that is, that's a box on the outside of the building where you can put a key to your building. And then your fire chief could have a key to the box so that in the event of him needing to get into the building, he doesn't have to smash down the door or wait for you to arrive. He can grab the key. In this case, we opened it up and we found out that the key that was in there no longer worked in the door. So it, again, just kind of like the value of making those connections and updating your plan and checking on all the places where you have things like keys and other things that you may need to have that other people are relying on in order to be able to respond effectively to an emergency at your organization. And it's also great to have them in your space, and you can help them learn more about the value of what you do. And they might look around and say, wow, you've got a great community room here. This would be a wonderful spot if we needed to have a place to set up an incident command system and have our center here. So it may be that there's things that you can offer. And libraries really are one of the places that we all look to in our communities to be open and to be able to keep us warm and connected and charging our devices and all of that stuff that seems so important when things are going down. So yeah, the walkthroughs, invitations to events, ask them for help. You can try to get them to get involved in your training. One thing I'm hoping to do at the state level is actually have an event where the fire academy does a live burn of some collection materials, discards, and then we get to try to salvage them. So I'll certainly let everybody know at Department of Libraries if that comes to pass. But working at your local level to make those connections is really valuable. And staff, of course, turnover both within emergency management and within the library. And then really important to to lean on your existing networks. And I've found in Vermont in my short time here that there are all sorts of networks. Many of them are informal. Some of them were latent. VACDaRN kind of sprang out of a group that had existed. The Collections Care and Conservation Alliance that I'm also involved in is kind of a second generation of the Vermont Museum and Gallery Alliance. So sometimes there are groups there. You might have your informal networks. It might be more formal, like the Vermont Library Association. So where can you connect with people to find a buddy? Where can you find that person who, like Sarah for Lucinda, kind of bugs you into doing stuff, and holds you to account, or does a walkthrough at your place and then you go do a walkthrough at their place because you're new to the place, so you might see things that they won't see because they're there all the time. It can be fun to come together to do tabletop exercises, or to actually do a drill or a training. And the more formal end of it, you could actually work up a mutual aid agreement. And that could be, again, a matter of something you just decide on verbally, or you could create a document saying, we will come to each other's aid in the event of a disaster. And this is the stuff we can offer to each other. These are the resources we have. And there's a picture of Lucinda. Yeah, jump in, please.
Can I add on to that? So after,
Absolutely.
Thinking about that too, when we were thinking about if we needed to freeze, if we had a water issue and we had to freeze large amounts of books, and reaching out to Dan and Witz in our town to see if their freezers would be available. It was like a different way to sort of approach a problem. Instead of hyper focusing on maybe bringing in refrigerated trucks, we, as you had suggested, to look around in our community, even if that community was like 5 or 10 miles down the road, to put together a list of people who would provide that mutual aid. And that was very helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And you all, your communities, and your communities know you pretty well. So there's things you can be aware of that you can bring to each other's attention too. So that's what I've got, and we have a few minutes now for questions. And I also want to give Lucinda a chance to speak about anything else that she thinks we need to cover that I either glossed over or did not address.
Sorry, I'm suffering from a slight Charlie horse at the moment.
Oh, well then you're off the hook.
I'll be back. I'm just gonna walk it out. Hold on.
Walk it out. You're not walking enough. I did want to put out there that I know one of the folks who registered for the workshop today submitted a question in advance that I found I've been chewing on all week, and if that person's on the webinar today, I'd love to have you jump in as well. The question was, how can the library use an equity lens as it develops its emergency response plans and protocols, including its procedures around information outreach? And again, I tend to think about emergency response plans and protocols as things that are uniformly applicable, but this got me thinking about what the needs of the community that you serve at your library might be, and how they might be different from other communities. And I would think that would be a kind of a way in on that question. So if you have folks who are differently abled who use your library, and you have a couple floors and you have an elevator, and then the fire alarm goes off and someone who cannot walk independently is up on the second floor and the elevator's not working, do you have a plan for how to get that person out of the building? So that kind of thing occurred to me. For communities that have users for whom English is not a first language and maybe are not fluent in English, do you have signage for how to get out of the building that's really easy to understand, and does not rely on English words to help people get out? Is there symbols and other ways you can show through maps and other visual tools how people can exit? So there's things to think about in relation to who might be specifically using your library that you may want to think about. And again, we're thinking about everything these days with kind of a DEI lens. So I love that it's like, yes, and disaster preparedness and response. How can we think about it that way as well? So other ideas on that, I'd love to hear, as well as any questions you might have.
So feel free to write questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask verbally. You can raise your hand if you want. There's a raise your hand icon in the toolbar. This is a great time to ask someone who knows a lot about this some questions, if anybody has any. I'll just make a comment that I thought it was great, Rachel, that you mentioned working with your municipality for municipal libraries, that if your library is a municipal building, you don't have to do this on your own. You can get help. And that's a really important thing to remember.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, and Joy and I've talked a little bit about what a next step might be. And I really mean it, that Sally and I are here to facilitate and support, cajole, and we can be your buddy if you find that, if you're feeling really like, I do want to get this plan developed, and I'm not sure how I'm going to manage to do that because I have so many other things on my plate. We would love to talk to you and to figure out a way to move forward and help you do that, whether it's a single library or if there's a small cohort who want to get together and do that. So don't hesitate to get in touch with us or to let Joy know if you'd like to have an informal support network around trying to get a disaster plan done in the next 6 months or something like that. I mean, we would set a realistic goal, but something that actually is going to be on a timeline. The other thing we could do is do some tabletop scenarios, and that could be done virtually as well, where we walk through a simulated disaster as a group. It's not quite the same as having the real thing, but it gives you a chance to, again, try to flex that preparedness mindset so that you are more open to and prepared for it if you do, and when you do eventually have to respond in the moment. One thing that I've done in some workshops is and this would have to be a hands-on one unless you wanted to sacrifice one of your own books, is to do just a very simple exercise in how to dry a wet book. And if you've never held a soaking wet book, just that can be a revelation. It's just like, what is it like? But if you've done it, again, it becomes familiar to you and you've had some experience with how to put the blotting paper in and how to set it up for starting to work toward getting dry. That means that if you do end up having to do that for your own collection, you've already done it, and that can be huge.
So Rachel, there was a comment from Laura Keenan about the EDI thing, another thing to consider. Thinking about how you communicate your plans to the community in languages, sort of, so not just the signs, but communicating your plan. And then Tom, did you want to say something?
Yes, thanks. Just a brief comment. Rachel, you mentioned earlier that now that we're going back into our buildings, it's a great time to think about this, and that struck a chord with me. Even though I'm in the building once a week, I've been actually seeing it with new eyes in a way, and actually, I'm sure that once I'm there more, I'm going to start to notice things that maybe I didn't before. So, no time like change to make changes and to think about things maybe with a different lens. So, I really like that. I like that idea, and maybe that'll inspire me to finally figure out where the water shutoff is in our building.
Or to at least know who knows where the water shutoff is.
Well, I know who knows, but I'm not sure that I know how to get in touch with him at any given hour. So,
right. And so much, and back to something Lucinda said about communication, like in the event of, and again, this was kind of a slow moving disaster, the pandemic, but what was most valuable to her about her plan was kind of phone tree and the identification of the different roles and responsibilities. You know, who's going to do what? And it's also good then for those people to know what they're responsible for. So part of the importance of having that training and review once the plan is developed.
I think that was a real standout last week that Sally said too, how just having all the numbers like in a really obvious place. So when you're stressed and you're, you know, so a disaster has happened, you don't have to go looking for it. It's just like, here it is on the front page of my plan. That's who I need to call.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of Lucinda, is your Charlie horse better? And would you like to say
Yes.
anything? Good. Welcome
It
back.
is. Thank you. I just downed a banana. Yeah, the one thing I wanted to say too was, you know, it was so helpful having a cohort. But one of the things I've learned from this pandemic is that, which I was unaware of before, and which was built during the pandemic, which I think will do us all well as we move forward with disaster planning in any way, shape, or form, is we've created these new cohorts since the pandemic started, right? We've either created cohorts within our library community, within whatever the mutual aid was within your own town or municipality. I feel much closer to many of the people in government in Norwich, but also on the state level. Like, I feel like now the ACCD might be my go-to for lots of things that I didn't even know they existed beforehand, you know? And I think that as a takeaway, as you're looking at putting together disaster plan, I would expect most of us now have like a much longer list of people that we could reach out to. And that will be expected. You know, we're now used to being asked to participate or to lend our thoughts or our expertise. And I think that's actually a really positive thing to use as you go forward with disaster planning or risk mitigation preparation.
Yeah, excellent point about the ACCD. I was just thinking about that the other day, how like I go to that site all the time and I didn't know very much about them at all before this, and it's such a great resource. So does anybody else have any more comments, or it looks like someone's writing something in the chat? I did put a link to the evaluation for today's workshop, and also a reminder that this is being recorded, and the one last week was recorded also, and that is already up on our website and on our Niche Academy page. So there are links to that in the chat, and you can find them on our website as well. The evaluation, well, I think actually that that project outcome is down right now, so that I think it will try it later. But I will check it later. I was trying it just to be, I thought I'd double check before I put it up there, and even the site itself is not coming up. So yeah, I think that's a project outcome thing, but I will check again later, and if it isn't, send you a different link. So I appreciate everyone doing those. It's really helpful for us to be able to evaluate what we're doing and think about future workshops. Your feedback is really helpful for us doing that. So thank you so much, Rachel and Sally, if you're on the call. Thank you again for last week. This has been so helpful, and I know it's kind of an intimidating, I find it an intimidating subject, and you both managed to make it a little bit less so, which is really an important thing. So, and just gave us really practical tools to use as well. So thank you, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks, Lucinda.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Joy. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Lucinda. Bye.